It's my pleasure to welcome Todd Hutchinson to give us a remote seminar, a Natural and Applied Sciences seminar. Todd is a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service. He got a bachelor's at the University of Louisville in biology. I didn't ask him what year. And followed that up by a master's at Miami University in Ohio in botany. And then I started working for the Forest Service in the 90s and was able to go back and get a PhD while remaining with the Forest Service. He got that PhD in ecology from Ohio State in 2004 and has been remained at the Forest Service that whole time. And Todd is going to talk to us today about prescribed burns. And FYI, I've started recording a session. I believe participants have the ability to send chats. I can send an email or send me an email if anybody's having some kind of problem interfacing with the system. And I will promote faculty members up to moderators in case anything else needs to be maintained. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd. Thanks again, Todd.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you all today, and I'm going to be focusing on some long-term studies that we've been doing down in southern Ohio, in the Appalachian part of Ohio, looking at prescribed fire in oak forests. And with that, I'll just go ahead and get started here. Okay, so this just to provide some context here, the central hardwood and Appalachian regions of the eastern United States, you see it in the green area here on the map, is really characterized across most of that landscape by a dominance of oaks, of several oaks. That's a white oak there on that slide, but there's usually five or six upland oaks that can dominate, and there's a lot of other species in the mix too that we know from pollen records and from historical land surveys that oaks really have been dominant on this landscape for millennia. And just a little bit of ecology of how oaks regenerate, and there's a process that sometimes it works pretty well, and sometimes it's not working so well. So there's as you all know, oaks produce acorns that are it's a masting species, so they produce periodically. And really, the only time that a lot of oak seedlings can establish is when there's a heavy mast crop, when that food source overwhelms the herbivores and predators that eat the acorns. So it's kind of a periodic cycle of when seedlings can establish. Then it's really, next step is for the environment on the forest floor to be adequate for oaks to grow. And that's what's not happening a lot in a lot of forests because they're too shady these days. So on the right photo here, you can see this is an oak sapling in the forest, which is not very common in most forests today because there's just not enough light for the oaks to get to that size. They're pretty intolerant of heavy shade. And then when there's a canopy disturbance, and that can be a natural disturbance from trees dying or a windstorm or timber harvest, the oaks will only regenerate and replace those trees in the canopy if there was a good population of oak seedlings that were large on the forest floor. And we call that advanced reproduction or advanced regeneration. So it has to be a lot of it, and it has to especially be large in size for oaks to be able to succeed to be part of that next forest. And there's really been two laws of oak silviculture, oak regeneration and management. Is that there must be those competitive sources of oak regeneration, so large seedlings or possibly smaller trees that could stump sprout after they were harvested. And secondly, there must be a timely and sufficient release of that canopy. It can't just be a small canopy gap that's open for 5 or 10 years because oaks are relatively intolerant of shade. So there has to be a significant canopy disturbance. It doesn't have to be a clear cut necessarily, but it has to get enough light for enough time to allow those oaks to really claim a spot in the next forest. And it really, oak regeneration really varies a lot across the landscape. Not as much probably up in Wisconsin where it's flatter, but where in the Appalachians, where I'll be focusing on today, oak, there's a lot of varying microclimate conditions based on slope and aspect and parent material, the bedrock, primarily slope and aspect, so that there's conditions created in the same watershed or the same landscape where you have very dry sites, intermediate sites, and then sites that are more mesic. And oak regeneration definitely varies across that landscape, even when oak is predominant in the canopy. There are sites that have intrinsic accumulation of oak seedlings, so that means when those mast events happen, there will be oaks that establish and survive until the next mast event. And so you sort of get an accumulation on these very dry sites. So these are upper south facing slopes. There's cloudy, low moisture and nutrient availability. They can be pretty shady, but not extremely shady, like 5% of full sunlight. There's really less understory competition for the oaks. There are really less species that compete with them on these very dry sites. In contrast to that, going to the other end of the spectrum on these very mesic sites that have a lot of soil moisture, even though there may be oak in the overstory, oak may be dominant in the overstory. These sites that are nutrient rich, they tend to have a lot more understory competition. The canopies are fuller. There's often 1 or 2% of full sunlight is all that reaches the forest floor unless there's a canopy disturbance. And these conditions are where oak regeneration, even if the seedlings are establishing, they're not able to survive and sustain themselves on these conditions. And then there's a whole range in between that. Those really dry conditions where oaks do tend to accumulate might only make up 10 or 20% of the landscape. There's a lot of areas that are having problems with oak seedling accumulation. And when we look at forest inventory data, this is forest inventory and analysis from the eastern United States. You can see there this tan region is the central hardwoods region. And over the last 30 years, so these are permanent forest plots that are resampled periodically, scattered all across each state. You can see that over time, the importance here, the two bars here are a decline in quercus, the oaks, and then an increase in acer, which would be primarily red maple and sugar maple. So this is people have been seeing this for a long time. They know there's some problems with oak regeneration, but it's now starting to show up in this forest inventory data where the relative abundance of oak is showing to be declining since they've been doing these widespread inventories for the last 30 years. So the main problem is we get these oak seedlings on the forest floor in an undisturbed forest, and it's very shady, and what you want to get is these large oak saplings, large seedlings and saplings, but that's not happening under current conditions. And so what we see is that often oak is dominant in the overstory. This picture here is showing a large northern red oak, a sugar maple that is established. The oak is shade intolerant, and needs to establish where has been a big disturbance. The maples, though, are very shade tolerant, especially sugar maple. Red maple is also fairly shade tolerant. Beech, those types of species, they can really establish and grow in the understory of an oak forest until they become pretty prominent in the midstory and subcanopy of that forest. And this is some forest inventory data from Ohio showing the size of trees here of oaks and maples from 2 inches in diameter up 30 inches in diameter. The blue here is the oaks. You can see that predominantly the large trees that established 75 to 150 years ago, a lot of times, are the oaks, but there's very less and less oaks in the smaller size classes, which are then dominated to a greater extent by maples and other species. And so that's shown in the understory here too. We've got, in addition to those large sugar maple, full-size tree that was in the previous slide. There's a lot of smaller saplings. Red maple here is on the left. This is a stand with a lot of beech that's growing in an oak stand, and there's just very little light reaching the forest floor. You can see there's really sparse amounts of tree seedlings or herbaceous plants in some of these understories that are extremely shady. Okay, well then we've got this oak regeneration problem. It's widespread across the eastern United States. It's something that people have been aware of for a lot of years, but you know, there's always that question of, well, you know, maybe nature's just kind of taking its course, and it's these forests are succeeding to more mesophytic types like maples and beech. Maybe that's just a natural process, but it is really important to sustain oaks, probably on the landscape. And I should say that oaks are still abundant on the landscape. It's just that there's this trend that if it keeps going, there's just going to be gradually less and less oak without the proper management as we go into the future. And oaks are so critical in the central hardwoods region. Well, they've been abundant. The wildlife that's been here for thousands of years has adapted to the oaks, especially to the hard mass they produce. It's very valuable for a lot of wildlife species. Even they have the richest set of arthropods that feed on their leaves. They're just a really keystone species in these ecosystems, in addition to having a timber value and just aesthetic value as well. All right, and these trends are happening. It varies across the region. This shift from oak dominance to dominance by other typically mesophytic species, and there's probably a lot of interacting factors that are causing this. There's some pretty strong evidence that we're just in the last century, we just have not had severe droughts as we did back in the 15 and 16 and 1700s that would be maybe 10 or 15 year droughts. And oaks are very tolerant of drought compared to some of the other species. Land use history, you know, in the eastern United States, pretty much every inch of ground has been manipulated in one way or the other, and typically especially where there's been lands that have been converted for agriculture into pastures and crops. When those are abandoned and they undergo old field succession, it's often the wind dispersed species, ashes and maples and other species that tend to occupy those sites rather than the more heavy seeded oaks and hickories. Atmospheric nitrogen deposition from the burning of fossil fuels is probably playing a role in the shifting species composition by changing soil nutrient status and possibly the mycorrhizae, the types of mycorrhizae that are associated with oaks, which are the ectomycorrhizae versus the endomycorrhizae that are associated with most of the other species that are increasing. Another problem is high grade logging, or just really inappropriate logging. This often happens primarily on private lands where there's a stand of oaks, and basically just a logger buys the timber and just cuts the large oaks and takes those away, and there's that forest is going to succeed other species if it's not cut at the right time. Deer browsing is certainly a problem. I know up in Wisconsin with forest regeneration, it varies a lot across the region. But one thing that I've really focused my career on is the lack of fire exclusion that we've had in the last 100 years now in the eastern United States, and then trying to use fire as a tool to improve oak regeneration and to sustain oak forests into the future. So that's what I'll be focusing on today. And when really describe fire it's been used in prairies for 50 or more years, but it really hasn't been thought of as something that would be useful for forests and for forest regeneration in the eastern United States anyway, really in the past couple decades. And there has been a lot of work done on it. And people have known for a long time that oak has both drought and fire adaptations that can protect it from fire. And so some of those are for the oak trees. The trees that the overstory trees and the midstory trees tend to have thicker bark, which protects from the heat of a surface fire. And they're also very good at compartmentalizing wounds. When there is a wound, as in this slide on an oak tree, they can produce callus tissue that grows around that wound. And a lot of times, even from the outside of a tree, you can't tell that it has a fire scar on the inside. Oak seedlings, what's really important is that oaks sort of grow like a carrot. They invest a lot of their resources into the root. They have a high root to shoot ratio. When there is a fire that burns in the understory of a forest, those oak seedlings that are top killed by the fire can resprout from dormant buds. There's a lot of stored carbohydrates that can allow vigorous resprouting after a fire. And then really what's some recent investigations have shown that we always kind of knew that oak litter seemed to burn better than other species, but there's been some quantitative analyses now that oak litter is more flammable. The way that it curls on the forest floor, it dries out faster, it doesn't absorb as much water. It really does provide a much better fuel for a surface fire than does a fuel of the maples and poplars and some of those mesophytic species. So it really, oak has this whole suite of adaptations that should favor it in a regime where there's periodic fire. And we've learned a lot in the Appalachian region now. In the last 20 years, we've learned a lot about how common fire was in the East. It's something that really wasn't appreciated before. Using several methods, primarily dating of fire-scarred trees, old trees from the Appalachians, we've learned a lot about how common fire was in the past. So there was a recent synthesis done by Charles Lafon of these fire history studies across 44 sites across the Appalachians. And 20 of those sites even went back before 1800, so probably at before European settlement or near that time. And from all those studies, what was found was that fire was very frequent. It averaged to occur about every 7 years. That ranged some sites every 2 years up to about every 20 years. And these were not linked to climate, because they can look at the historic drought conditions from the tree rings and from drought reconstructions when the fires occurred, and typically they weren't necessarily associated with drought, and that when they occurred in the dormant season, usually in the spring and falls, that indicates that they were probably human ignition, because there's not a lot of lightning fires in the spring and fall. But there certainly were some lightning fires, but we think that this predominantly these were anthropogenic fires. Okay, so then I want to shift gears here a little bit to the research that I've been involved with, fire ecology research in Appalachian, Ohio. Really focusing on first kind of giving an overview of the study area and some of the history of the area, and then going into some of the prescribed fire research that we've conducted. And I first want to thank a lot. I've collaborated with a lot of folks over the years, and just, there's probably more than this. These are the main folks: Forest Service scientists and university scientists that I've worked with. So a lot of what I'll be showing today was a real collaborative effort. All right, so the study setting in southern Ohio. So if you all can see the cursor here, it's down in the south central part of Ohio, which is in the Appalachians. It's part of the Allegheny Plateau that stretches into Pennsylvania and West Virginia, a little bit into Kentucky. But this is hill country, Appalachian. There's a lot of coal mining in this region. Generally, you do have this topography that I mentioned allows for different plant community types across the landscape, ranging from dry to moist. So that's the setting, but generally this area has always does have relatively dry and acidic soils, which are good land for oak, and oaks were historically abundant on this landscape. Okay, and then really all throughout the eastern United States there have been accounts of Native Americans using fire to manage the landscape before European settlement, and Ohio has plenty of these accounts as well. There's just one of them from eastern Ohio in the late 1700s about the Indians prefer to hunt hunting deer in large companies. After they'd surrounded a considerable tract of country, they let the dry leaves and grass on fire. The poor animals fly towards the middle to escape the flames, and the hunters closing in upon them by following the kill them, or following the fire, kill them with certainty so that hardly one escaped. And you get the sense, it's not very quantitative, but that the Native Americans, as their populations waxed and waned, the amount of fire on the landscape probably did as well. But southern Ohio had always, until the depopulation in the 1600s, it had a pretty substantial Native American population. But then when European settlement progressed into Ohio about 1800 is when those Native Americans were moved out, and the Europeans came in to settle about 1800. Of course, there was the first 50 years or so in the early 1800s were primarily agriculture and smaller scale activities in the river valleys. But then, as the industrial era around the Civil War, 1850s on, there became these more exploitation and widespread harvesting of the forest. This is a charcoal iron furnace here that was study sites I'll be talking about today. Were all harvested back in the 1800s, sometimes repeatedly to supply the charcoal for these iron furnaces. And there was also railroads took a lot of wood, so there was just from 1850 to late 1890s, early 1900s, pretty much all the land was cleared in one way or the other, and then has regrown since. So there was this sense that at that time there was a problem with wildfires as these forests were regenerating in the early part of the 20th century. This was also when there was some huge fires that happened out in Wisconsin in the late 1800s and out west in the United States in 1910. But there was really this push to all across the country was to control these fires and get to conduct fire suppression, and that began in Ohio in 1923. We do know from an early publication that there was lots of fire in the woods at that time in the 1920s, but then it was pretty well controlled by the 1930s and 1940s. So they were very good at it once they started to control fire. All right, just a little bit about the history of the forests in this area. We have done some work with looking at the original land surveys to determine the original land surveyors. Ohio was sort of a training ground where they first started doing these systematic land surveys that were later the GLO surveys that happened in Wisconsin and in the upper Midwest. But there are some decent records in Ohio as well, and so we looked at these old witness tree records of every half mile or mile. Trees were chosen to mark those boundaries, and the size and the species of the tree were selected, and that you can really piece together sort of a broad scale view of what forest composition was like before there was any widespread and very little European settlement on the landscape. So for our area that I'll be talking about today, this was a 5-county area in southern Ohio. We looked at over 5,000 of these witness trees, and in 1800, really the thing that stands out is that it was dominated by oaks and hickories, particularly white oak, Quercus alba, made up about 1 in every 3 of those witness trees. on the landscape, and some of the species that are becoming more common today were not very abundant back at that time. And this is a comparison here looking at the forest inventory and analysis from about 2010 of the percentage of trees that are greater than 5 inches in diameter. So they are probably selecting more small trees in the modern surveys, but you can still see there's just been a pretty dramatic shift in the composition of the forest. There still are a lot of larger oaks and hickories, but as far as numbers go, because there aren't as many small trees, it's really been the shift to sugar maple, red maple, yellow poplar, and then some of these other mesophytic species, or the wind dispersed species. Right, so this is what the forests tend to look like that I'll be talking about today. The mature forests that have been relatively undisturbed. Generally, this mixture of oaks and hickories in the overstory. There is also northern red oak, although it's not quite as abundant on these drier sites. And there's some yellow poplar in the overstory, but the understory, the midstory and understory is dominated by these shade tolerant species, the maples, also species like black gum and beech and sourwood that have really established and filled that subcanopy of these forests. And then looking at, we did do some fire history work, some tree ring analysis of fire history in southern Ohio. There were some stands that were thinned as part of a study I'll talk about here in a few minutes. But we were able to collect cross sections from both the oaks and the maples that were harvested in that forest thinning. This is an oak here in the upper right, showing dated fire scars that are dated to the calendar year of the fire. And then this is a couple of maples here that are about the same age, actually. There's this small maple is maybe just a couple inches in diameter. It's about 70 years old. This larger maple that was growing in a more open area was, about the same age, about 70 or 80 years old. So those maples are really quite flexible. They can grow in the shade, but then they can also grow pretty quickly in the sun as well. And what we found, looking at the trees, the bars on this timeline represent the years that the trees that we collected had established. So the brown bars are the oaks, and the green bars are the maples. This is primarily red maple, but some sugar maple as well. And so the oaks had established in this stand back around the time of the Civil War, and then there was a series of fires. These are documented fires. Major fires just tended to burn a greater percentage of the landscape. That we don't know for sure that they were more intense, but a greater percentage of the trees were scarred in these fires. But it was really not until that last major fire that occurred in 1923 that we really saw a significant amount of maple establishing in those stands. So this is, provides some evidence that it's really been that period after when fires stopped occurring in these woods that the maples were able to establish and then persist and to become a significant part of the forest today. And we also we wanted to try to find some deeper fire history going back further in Ohio, and there are some places where there are these old fire pines that have been dead for 30, 40, 50, even more years, but they have these cat-faced fire scars. And we collaborated with the tree ring laboratory at University of Missouri, who are really experts at being able to collect these and cross-date them to find out, even though they've been dead for a number of years, to find out the calendar year of when these trees established and when the fire scars occurred. These curling as that pine resin burns, and then as the tree tries to cover that wound around it, you can see it form these distinct fire scars. So from a couple sites, one in southern Ohio and then one in northern Kentucky, just across the Ohio River. Again, we found that fires were very frequent. They occurred over a whole time period, 1700s up until time, first fire to the last fire. The mean fire return interval was about 4 to 5 years in these stands that had they were sort of mixed oak and pine stands, but we used the pines primarily to get the fire history. And especially that industrial period after 1850, fires were occurring almost annually, every year or two in those stands. So we know historically there was a lot of fire in these stands. Okay, so then the thought is, we know that oak forests are decline. Oak regeneration is poor. There's a lot of species that are abundant in the forest that were not historically. We do know that fire was one of the factors that has changed a lot over time, and so the thought has been to use prescribed fire as a management tool to open those forests up and use those fire adapted traits of the oaks, which are much less so in maples and some of the other species, to use fire to shift that species composition in favor of the oaks. All right, so the prescribed fires that we conducted. So this was a study that we're just looking at fire. There's no timber harvesting involved. It was a long-term study. We ended up having anywhere from 3 to 5 fires per stand over a period of about 8 or 9 years. And the fires are conducted in the late March, early April in southern Ohio, when the leaf litter, you can see that oak leaf litter there, can dry out very quickly when the canopy is not closed yet. There's just these dry conditions that can last for 3 or 4 days that really dry out that leaf litter and make it very flammable. So that's the time period. And in this study, it was really the first prescribed fires that had been, especially research prescribed fires that had been done in southern Ohio. And so there was a lot of caution, and these fires tend to be pretty low intensity. And there's really thought of, you really do want to, even though larger oak trees are pretty resistant to fire, there definitely is high intensity surface fires even can kill large trees as well, which we didn't really want to do in this study. So the fires were pretty low intensity in the dormant season. So as far as the fire effects on forest structure, you can see over time here, we kept monitoring this study over a period of about 13 years, and these are prescribed fires shown on the timeline here. And this is just comparing stands that were burned and stands that were unburned. This first graph here is mid-story trees. So these are those trees that are about 10 to 25 centimeters diameter, or more like 4 to 10 inches in diameter. On those burn sites, it did reduce those by about a third. So, and you can see here a red maple that has been it's been top killed by fire. The stem was killed, and it has resprouted, but that mid-story or pole-size stem was top killed, and then the subsequent fires might come through and also kill those resprouts. And then saplings, these smaller stems that are 1 to 4 inches in size or so, they're more susceptible to fire, and we saw an 80% decrease in fire. So these low intensity prescribed fires tended to not affect the overstory trees at all, but tended to, especially as the trees got smaller and smaller, tended to top kill more and more. And this is some visuals here of what a typical plot might have looked like before burning. You can see it was pretty dense, and then after a couple burns, that understory has started to open up a bit. And then by year 13, after we've had 3 burns on this site, you see it's really much more open there, the understory. So it's sort of a slow gradual process that requires multiple fires, but you can eventually get to this point at more of an open understory that's getting a little bit more light to the forest floor. But what we did see in this study, when we looked at the oak regeneration after that first 5 or 6 years where we'd had anywhere from 2 to 4 fires, you can see the oaks. This is in the fall. The oaks tend to be these more dark green because they they tend to hold on to their leaves. They stay green a little bit longer. But the oaks were, resprouted just fine after these multiple fires. But we noticed that, because the overstory hadn't been reduced much, it was still pretty shady. In the understory, that there was not a lot of height growth. That these oaks were definitely alive, and they seemed to be getting a little bit bigger, but not. We weren't getting large. We weren't getting oak saplings and large seedlings across most of the landscape. We were a little bit disappointed. This has been after 5 or 6 years of research. But then, sort of serendipitously, what happened in years 8 to 10 of the study is throughout several areas in southern Ohio, there was a period of white oak decline where patches of white oaks were dying for multiple reasons that related to insect defoliation and other factors. But we had these patches of white oaks were dying, usually several trees in a patch. And what we noticed that in those sites that had been burned, we all of a sudden that oak regeneration really started to grow. So it was growing very, very well in those small to moderate sized canopy gaps. And so we set up sort of a study within a study where we looked at specifically at these canopy gaps, which were just sort of scattered throughout the stands. And we looked at gaps that were in sites that had been burned several times versus gaps that were in unburned stands. And so the gaps were about the same size. They had about the same number of dead trees, but you can see that the number of saplings and poles per hectare was drastically different. Lots of saplings and poles in those unburned gaps, not as many in the burned gaps, and there's of course more sunlight reaching the forest floor in those burned gaps as well. So this is what species composition wise, these are all those unburned gaps. The saplings and poles tended to be, there was a lot of them, and they were dominated by these shade tolerant species, so red maple, sugar maple, beech. But in those burned gaps, we saw, a lot of that had been eliminated. So that sapling and pole layer had been greatly reduced, except on a few plots. And when we looked at that larger oak regeneration in those unburned gaps, the oak and hickory here is the red. It averaged about 1,000 oak and hickory large seedlings per hectare, which is pretty good. But what's really going to fill these gaps is those saplings and poles from the previous graph, because they've got a much greater head start. But then in those burn gaps, you can see there's much more that large oak and hickory regeneration, 7,000 of those stems per hectare. Also a lot of sassafras here, which is the yellow, but that tends to not just for the long term. So there was really good oak regeneration in these canopy gaps, and it also tended to be on the dry, a little bit greater on the dry sites. And also on the larger gaps. It's where we tended to have the greatest oak regeneration, but it was really good in all these gaps. And this is what a gap looked like 5 years after gap formation. So you can see those seedlings are getting bigger. Okay, so I'd like to just go on to another study that we did, is the fire and fire surrogate study. This was part of a national study that looked at using prescribed fire, mechanical thinning, and their combination to manage forests. It had historically had periodic or frequent fire, like the ponderosa pine forest out west, and then the mixed oak forest and some of the pine savannas and forests in the east. So we had a study site in southern Ohio that was involved in this study, and it really was fairly similar to the first study, except that there was thinning. It was a treatment where a third of the basal area was cut, generally the smaller trees, and then there was the combination of thinning and fire and well. And we had repeated fires over this 17-year time period that we just took the last sample a few years ago. And what was really different, one of the things that was really different in this study was that we wanted to get fires that were a little bit higher intensity to try to, especially on those burn-only units, to try to open up stands a little bit more. And so we really have a variety of fire intensities, and we didn't really want to kill overstory trees, but that did happen in patches. And so we had everything on the landscape from low severity fires to areas where the overstory was actually completely killed. And this would be, tended to be patches within a stand. It wasn't the whole stand, but it tended to be those drier patches, those upper slopes, where we did have high severity fires. It really created quite different conditions, more like a timber harvest than a low intensity prescribed fire. And that created a lot of different light conditions across those plots, ranging from closed canopy to very open. These are hemispheric photographs that have been analyzed to look at light. And what we saw in this study was that over time, here the red and the orange are the colors that are associated with fire. So over time, the overstory was really reduced by that thinning. But because those fires were high intensity, that over time, really those even the stands that were just burned and didn't have any thinning, also the overstory density was reduced substantially. And then we saw that as well with the mid-story trees, fire reducing the density quite a bit, the mid-story trees, and then the saplings. And in the stands that were only thinned, basically the mid-story and the sapling layer regained after the harvest, because all those smaller trees, the maples and beeches that had resprouted and grew back into that sapling and mid-story layer. So as far as looking at the oak regeneration then on this study, looking at those large oak seedlings, again, greater than 60 centimeters or greater than 20 couple feet in size. Looking at the mix of species, what we saw was that in initial thinning and high intensity fires, we did tend to get a lot of competition for the oaks. That over time, you can see the maples and beeches tended to start to decrease. Black gums and sourwoods started to decrease. Yellow poplar germinated like crazy on the thin and burn plots, but then with repeated fires, it tended to come back down. Yellow poplar regeneration, sassafras as well. Really, the oak and hickory was really that group that continued to increase in abundance, those large seedlings over time. So it was really a substantial part of that regeneration layer by year 16 and 7. And we also saw some pretty large differences in the landscape effects of fire. And I had sort of mentioned that, but basically these drier southwest-facing slopes here you see in the tan color tended to also burn hotter and have more open sky than the mesic, the purple here, the mesic north-facing slopes. That's reflected in this the change in canopy openness over a time period. These are the dry, the intermediate, and the moist spots. And then oak regeneration sort of mirrored that too. But we tended to get these bars here is dry, intermediate, and mesic for each year. The white is dry, gray is intermediate, and the black is mesic. So that over time, you can see that large oak regeneration is increasing quite a bit on the dry and intermediate plots to a much less on those moist plots. But really, those moist plots comprise about 25% of the landscape. It's just really hard to get oak regeneration back on those moist sites. So primarily, though, but about 70 to 75% of the landscape is having very good oak regeneration. And then I would like to just to shift gears a little bit here. We also were monitoring plant diversity, how these fire and fire surrogate treatments affected plant diversity. So looking at every species that's growing on the forest floor, herbaceous and woody species. And what we found over time, again, it was primarily the fire. This is the number of species found per meter squared. Started out on all these plots about 8 species per meter squared. And over time, both the thin and burn and the burn plots nearly doubled in the number of species that were occupying these 1 meter squared quadrats. And these are pretty much all native species. We didn't have a big influx of exotic species in certain isolated areas. So it's really the fire and not the harvesting that really increases that species diversity over time. And it's really a function of that fire burning off burning the leaf litter on the forest floor, which allows the greater seed bank germination. Normally, that leaf litter is sort of a mechanical barrier to some species germinating and establishing. And then just also getting more light to the forest floor tends to increase the number of species that can grow. And we looked at 96 common species, and you can see that basically a lot more of those common species increased in frequency over time than decreased. So most of those native species are showing some increase over time in the frequency with these fires. And there is, I've been talking about, this is research that was done by a colleague that is stationed in Pennsylvania, but this is research that was done in Virginia. There's another method where using fire, a single fire, where it can be extremely effective. And this is called the shelter wood burn method. So it's a method where there's a partial harvest that really opens up the canopy to some degree, lets a lot of light to the forest floor in an oak stand. And so you get oak seedlings that are starting to grow and put on roots, but also there's a lot of competition. And then if you can come through with a fire during the early growing season, so this would be in April or May when things are already starting to leaf out, one single fire, if it's done at the right time, can have a dramatic effect on tree regeneration. All these dead stems, you can see how tall they were. That's all yellow poplar. It was almost totally killed by a growing season fire. And all these seedlings that are coming up beneath that yellow poplar are oaks, which have been growing slower above ground because they invest most of their early growth into the root. Now they're going to be free to grow and to become a much more dominant part. So the single prescribed fire, if done at the right time, can really have dramatic results. And I just want to follow up with couple slides here on a new study where we're looking at there's most of the forests in southern Ohio and in the east are in private lands, and there really need to be non-fire treatments that landowners can do to try to increase oak regeneration. And so we were looking at a study of white oak, which is of particular interest because it's really declining in our region. So we followed a cohort of after a large acorn crop in 2014. We followed a cohort of white oak seedlings that had established, and instead of using fire, we used mid-story removal with herbicide to create more light to the forest floor. How that affected these new cohort of oak seedlings. And this is the study that Brianne Spencer is worked on this summer, and she's actually harvested the roots of a number of these white oak seedlings, and is going to be looking at root development in these different treatments as part of her master's project. Okay, so this is what it looks like. We just do a hack and squirt with an herbicide that kills the mid-story stems and also prevents them generally from sprouting. And you can see it kind of looks like that same. It opens up the stand in the understory and can allow more light to the forest floor, just like fire can. This is pre and post light measurements on a plot that had mid-story removal, so it went from 2% to 18% full sun. We really haven't seen huge differences in the herbicided plots. They are having somewhat slightly better survival for those new seedlings that establish, but they just grow so slow, and we're hoping that Brianne's work on the roots might shed some light on that. Even though they're not, it might be the seedlings that are surviving are producing more roots. But the seedlings that had already been established and were a little bit bigger at the start of the study, that had established before, are having pretty good survival really across the treatment. That's just an example of how oak regeneration can be managed on private land as well. And then I would like to acknowledge all this research required a lot of field work, and that we've had great field crews that helped collect collect this field data at the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest and at our lab entering data. I'd like to acknowledge our land management partners who let us use their lands, the Ohio Division of Forestry and the Wayne National Forest, to conduct this research, and then funding. And they also conduct the prescribed fires. Funding was provided by the U.S. Forest Service, both the Washington office, the Northern Research Station, and then also partly the Fire and Fire Surrogate Study was funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. And I just like to put in a quick plug if you all are more interested in fire science. There's these regional fire science exchanges. There's one in the Appalachians that I'm part of. There's an Oak Woodlands, and then also the Tallgrass Prairie that's close to you all there, and includes southern Wisconsin anyway. That it's a good place to find out more information. It's sort of geared for scientists and managers to interact more, and there's presentations and webinars and things that are housed on the websites. It's a good resource. And then if I probably went a little bit long here, but if there time for questions, I'd be happy to answer questions. And thank you.
I believe there are questions. Bob, do you want to? Your mic should be active if you want to activate it, or you could chat it in.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Todd, for this presentation. This is really great work and really interesting study. We're interested in restoring oak savanna to one of our properties, UW Green Bay properties here, and actually land trust property that we are affiliated with. Anyway, in some of the and this was consistent in pre-settlement times, according to the land survey notes, we had an open oak sort of savanna environment here on the east shore of Lower Green Bay. So what I'm worried about in the future, if and when we are able to establish large oaks in this system, there are oak forests adjacent to this property. But what happens when the oaks, I guess, become, too productive? I've seen in oak savannas that are being restored at Navarino Wildlife Area to the west of us here, where there just are oak seedlings everywhere, so it really no longer becomes a savanna. They have to, it just becomes an oak forest. But what if we really want a savanna rather than a forest? What would you recommend to manage the property so that we could sustain that semi-open landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a problem that I know. I've heard about that problem a lot in the Missouri area, where they have oak savannas as well. That the oak regeneration, when you create these open conditions and you start using fire, because the oaks, if there are a lot of oak seedlings, they are very resistant to fire, and they can withstand even burning every few years. So I think there are probably other tools where you would actually have to use herbicide. If that's an option to help to reduce the amount of oak. It's probably fire alone, unless you were doing it every single year, you probably wouldn't be able to really eliminate those oaks. So yeah, probably some other treatments would be beneficial. I'm not sure. Herbicide's not always an option in every system. So.
Okay, thanks. Maybe mowing might work.
Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, and of course the oaks often will resprout, though. They've got that, especially once they get established, they've got that really robust root system. So they'll probably come back after mowing and fire. But that's the one advantage of herbicide, is that it can really kill them down to the roots.
And then Amy's asked a question here in the chat box. Can you see that chat box, Todd?
I guess I can go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then maybe I can see it here. Okay. Okay, yep. All right. See, was the understory plant diversity present in the seed bank, or did distance to seed source in the landscape play a big role, or a little of both? Yeah, it was good question, Amy. It was primarily the seed bank. Yeah, there was species that both had a sort of a medium term residence in the seed bank, and then even some species that, you know, probably have been sitting in the seed bank for 20, 30, 40 years that that came up after those fires. But yeah, mostly from the seed bank, and then I think just also the species that were maybe present but not abundant were able to grow better and flower more and produce more seeds, so that over time some of those species, even if they don't seed bank, they were able to establish more with repeated fires once they grew and produced more seed.
Another question in the chat box.
Okay, I see from Mike, this is a little off topic, but I'm interested in oak mass production. Do we have data on mast interval intensity and whether that is changing over time? Yeah, Mike, good question. And of course, that's a key part of oak reproduction as well. And there are some great long-term studies of mass production in different areas. That you know, there's some general rules of thumb that, you know, every 3 to 5 years there's a pretty significant mass crop, but it varies by species and site, in region. There's a lot of unknowns, and it does seem to be heavily tied to spring weather, when we aren't able to predict a good mast year yet. But when the oaks are flowering in the spring and then start to set seed, the weather conditions, it helps if the weather conditions are drier and less humid, but there's still a lot of unknowns there. So there's not really a strong indication of if it's changing over time. That's definitely a hypothesis that climate change will have an effect on mass production, but I'm not aware of any studies that are starting to document that yet.
Then another question from Karen there in the chat.
Okay. Okay, do you think changes in the abundance of small mammals could be affecting oak recruitment, or would mass seed production always be able to offset that? Yeah, I think, Karen, that's another good question. I have not seen studies where those changing populations have really impacted oak regeneration. Again, they tend to really establish well in those years when there's just massive acorn production, and it overwhelms those small mammals. But it definitely, you know, the reproduction is definitely in areas where there's heavy deer populations that deer can, you know, eat a lot of acorns and then also eat a lot of the seedlings. So the changing deer populations can be a huge deal. Okay, I'll just keep going here with the questions. Amy has a question. We are interested in the effect of fire on pollinators, especially native bees. Has your group looked at changes in these communities related to fire management? No, Amy, unfortunately, we didn't have anybody look at that on our sites, but I know there's some good work out there. There's some from the Southern Appalachians, and there's also some work that's being done in savannas. I think in the Midwest. So I do have some information on that, but not off the top of my head. But I think there are some good data sets out there now. And I see another question from Karen here. I suppose not very many acorns need to escape to replace a forest canopy. Yeah, that's very true. It's if you can, it's really more when that canopy disturbance happens. It's really more the size of the oak seedlings that are there. That if you've got large oak seedlings, yeah, it certainly doesn't take very many. But just when you do have massive numbers of oak seedlings, there's going to be that better chance that they're going to be more competitive, and some of those are going to be larger. So we definitely do like to see thousands and thousands per acre.
Do people have more questions, or might let Todd get on with his day?
Okay, I'm happy to answer. I see Mike has another question here. Forest patches in eastern North America don't get large enough so that naturally started fires can be effective. And I'm assuming Mike's probably talking about lightning caused fires. That's certainly in the southern Appalachians where the national forests tend to be large acreages that aren't interspersed with a lot of private land. And this would include the Smoky Mountains, that there are places where they let fires burn that have been started naturally by lightning, and that they try to achieve some of their goals of restoration. So yeah, there aren't many, but they're pretty much the southern Appalachians as far as this mixed oak forest type where natural fires can do the work. They're pretty uncommon given the conditions. It's pretty humid and wet often when lightning is occurring in the summer. So those fires, it is harder to get them to ignite at that time of the year.
Okay, I think we should thank Todd. I guess it's hard for people to clap. I can clap, but most people don't have their mics on. But Todd, we really appreciate you taking the time, and happy you didn't have to make a long trip up. But thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian, and thanks everyone for listening and having some good questions. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great weekend.
All right,
Yeah,
you too.
have a good weekend.
Okay.